Welcome to our online briefing, accessible vote by mail and safe in-person voting in Black communities. My name is Spencer Overton. I'm the president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, which is America's Black think tank. This session is part of a series of work that the Joint Center is doing on COVID policy and Black communities. Please go to jointcenter.org to see all of our work in this area. As we kind of get moving, I'd like to encourage folks to put themselves on mute if they're not speaking here. So we want everybody on mute, and then we'll go through our speakers. I want to start by thanking some key people. First, I'd like to thank our organizers, our key partners in organizing this event, LaShawn Warren of the Leadership Conference, and Lisa Kylar Barrett of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. I'd also like to thank the entire Joint Center staff and board for all their efforts to make this happen. In particular, Victoria Johnson, Dr. LaShonda Brinson, Vice President Jessica Fulton, Aaliyah Jones, and also our board chair, Barbara Johnson. Now, I want to turn to today's event. Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Many of us are sheltering in place, not leaving our homes because of the coronavirus. Black communities are hit particularly hard. For example, African Americans make up only 27% of the population of Milwaukee County, but as of this morning, accounted for over 61% of Milwaukee County's deaths from COVID-19. We're also in an election year, a presidential election year. Congress is considering additional legislation to address the coronavirus. And one big question is what changes need to be made to ensure that everyone is safe while they're voting and to ensure that all Americans can vote. In particular, this session today is focused on the voting changes that need to be made to ensure that Black communities are safe and can fully participate without votes being suppressed. Like a legislative hearing, we'll start with short opening statements of 4 minutes each from each of our speakers, and then we'll turn toward questions and discussion. Let me remind you that this session is being recorded and it will be made available to the public. For CBC staff with questions, just mention that you want to ask a question in the chat box and we'll call on you and you'll open up your mic and speak. Later on, I'll also give directions in terms of if you're calling in by phone here. And if you'd rather have me answer your question or ask your question rather as moderator, just let me know and we'll be happy to do that, to ask your question verbally. Just put it in the chat and we can ask it. And when I ask the question, I will not attribute it if it's a question that's in the chat, right? So right now, let's please turn toward our opening speaker, NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund President and General Counsel, and you know, a mentor and someone I look up to, Sherrilyn Ifill. Sherrilyn?
Thank you so much, Spencer. And that's Director Counsel. Oh,
excuse me. See, you're always keeping me in line. I appreciate it.
No, thank you so much. And good morning to all of you. Thank you so much for joining this call. This is such an important moment. You know, I have been sharing with my staff that I feel forever changed by Wisconsin last week. And I have been really insisting that we must not understate what we saw happen in the state of Wisconsin last week. We watched the failure of every level of state government and the United States Supreme Court to vindicate the rights of citizens to participate fully in the electoral process without risking their health and their lives. The same day that the election was held, we learned about the tremendous disparities in COVID infection and COVID deaths among African Americans in the state of Wisconsin, and particularly in Milwaukee. And so we literally faced the reality that our system of voting is so broken in this country that even with the full knowledge that we would be sending citizens into a circumstance that might compromise their health and might in fact result in their death, and even knowing that compromised health and those deaths would be visited in exponential rates upon African Americans, that election went forward. That was the bad news. And I really do want to point out that it was well known what the disparities were and how African Americans might be affected. You didn't see it in the Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court did not deign to talk about the reality, but the district court did, and it's worth reading that opinion. That was the bad news. The good news was, in a strange way, that voters, particularly African American voters, decided to show up. They decided that their need to be heard, that their rights as full citizens was as important as their health and their lives. And they stood in lines for hours with masks on, determined to be full citizens in this republic. And I have said that we must honor their action. We must honor their courage by ensuring that every African American has the ability to participate in the political process and cast a ballot without risking their lives going forward. And that means that we need the full array, the full panoply of voting options available for every voter. That means that we need in-person voting where possible. We need expanded early voting. We need expanded absentee voting, and we need to have extended time for requesting absentee ballots and for returning absentee ballots to the Board of Elections. We also need to increase curbside opportunities for voting, curbside voting, and curbside absentee ballot drop-off so that people, where possible, can drive by in their cars or walk up and simply drop their absentee ballot into a slot. We need no excuses absentee mail-in voting. You shouldn't have to explain what the situation is. This year, we all know what the situation is and we're all in the same boat. That's the excuse. It is vital that we also provide opportunities for online registration across the country. We need money to do this, which means that there has to be money in the stimulus bills to support states, but we also need to lean in to ensure that all states are accessing those funds and providing this array of opportunities for African Americans to participate in the political process. This is as important a civil rights moment as we are ever going to face. If we are going to honor those who put their lives on the line and who truly risk their lives to vote, Fannie Lou Hamer and Jimmy Lee Jackson, and Dr. Shuttlesworth and so many others, then this is our time today to ensure that we protect the right that was so powerfully vindicated by those heroes, and that we saw heroes vindicating that right last week standing on those lines in Wisconsin, that we have the legislation and that we have the resources that will allow us to ensure as we return to our communities that they will have the opportunity to fully participate in the political process. Thank you so much, Spencer, for convening all of us. And thank you all for this briefing and for the importance of making sure that we are all on the same page around this vital and important issue.
Well, thank you so much, Director Counsel Ifill. Appreciate it so much. And now we'll turn to the Leadership Conference President, Vanita Gupta. Vanita?
Thank you, Spencer, and thank you, Sherrilyn, for that really important and powerful opening. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Spencer and the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies for working with Chairwoman Bass and the Congressional Black Caucus to host this really important session about what we need to do to ensure that no African American is disenfranchised in the wake of COVID-19. And we're really grateful for the CBC's continued leadership on this critical issue. I think, as Sherrilyn mentioned, our nation really is in a state of an emergency, and our democracy is as well. And last Tuesday, all of us saw those images of Wisconsin voters lining the streets, having to choose between exercising their right to vote and protecting their public health and safety, and it was a true nightmare. The conservative majority of the Supreme Court ruled with Wisconsin Republicans and refused to extend the deadline for mail-in ballots. And as Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote, that meant that tens of thousands of people had to brave the polls or lose their right to vote. And we knew, as Sherrilyn mentioned, that in areas like Milwaukee, there were only 5 polling sites open compared to the usual 180 that led to long lines and overcrowding in the images that we all saw. And this is in a county where, as of this weekend, Spencer mentioned, African Americans make up 66% of the COVID-19 deaths, but only 27% of the population. So really the structural racism and disparities that were so horrifically on display, these demand urgent action. And Wisconsin, the good news of Wisconsin is that it was a wake-up call happening 7 months before the general election, but we really have no time to spare. Given our nation's history of voter suppression at the ballot box of communities of color and Black communities, we've got to be vigilant against any obstacles that prevent our communities from voting. And right now, that means that Congress has to help ensure that every person's voice and vote is counted as we build the future. On Monday, the Leadership Conference and more than 150 civil rights organizations sent a letter to Congress urging members to approve $4 billion in emergency funding to afford every voter a fair and safe and accessible opportunity to cast their ballot. Preparing for the upcoming primaries that have been postponed or that are happening in the weeks and months ahead, and the November elections is a massive undertaking. And as you know, Congress passed in the third stimulus package some money for election preparedness, but really the bill fell woefully short of what it's going to take to safeguard our democracy. Lawmakers approved only $400 million for state election assistance, and Congress now has to secure in the next package $3.6 billion in additional funding. The bill also included a requirement that states provide a 20% match in order to access these funds. Large states like California and New York, Texas, and Florida have had to put between $4 and $7 million of their own funds to access urgent election assistance funding under the CARES Act. There's a lot of states that simply can't afford right now, given the incredible fiscal burden and crisis that they're in, to put in any of their own money. And states have unanticipated expenses due to this pandemic. And so civil rights organizations like the Leadership Conference and those represented on this call are pushing for the elimination of that match requirement. We know that elections have to be a top priority in the next stimulus package. As Sherrilyn said, this is as important and crucial a moment for civil rights and voting rights as we've seen in our lifetimes. But time is of the essence. Epidemiologists are telling us that we may see a second wave of COVID-19 in the fall, and with under 7 months until the general election, states have to be ready. The general election cannot be postponed, and we can't allow a repeat of Wisconsin. So a lot of folks in the last several weeks have been pitching vote by mail as a universal solution to voter access. There's no question that vote by mail needs to be an option in every state in this country come November. But it's really important, and the civil rights community has been driving this, that voters also have a clear range of other options to safely and effectively cast their ballots. There's a concern that focusing exclusively on vote by mail could actually disenfranchise Black voters and other voters of color who've already been facing with a number of obstacles at the ballots for years. For example, surveys show that states reject absentee ballots at far greater rates for Black, Latino, and other voters of color than for white voters. Studies have also shown that voters of color vote by mail at lower rates, sometimes due to historical mistrust of the U.S. postal system, which of course also needs to be funded, and the mail-in ballot process. But we know vote by mail remains a really important option. There have to be guardrails in place, including prepaid postage, the ability of to postmark an absentee ballot on or before Election Day, reforms of signature matching laws to protect voters of color and allow people an opportunity to cure any discrepancies before their ballots are discarded, and then increased availability of drop boxes. Sherrilyn mentioned some of the range of options that voters need. If grocery stores can develop plans so that people can safely shop for essentials, we need to make polling places safe as well and make sure that they are available so that you don't see those lines. States have to extend early voting periods for at least 2 weeks prior to the election to allow for social distancing and safety protocols, expanded online voter registration, curbside voting, And then it's going to take massive voter education efforts this summer and early fall to make sure that voters understand all of the changes, election changes, and are prepared to vote in November. And that includes, for us, fighting disinformation, both by officials that have nefarious intent to seek to chill participation, but also fighting disinformation on social media platforms that really threatens to undermine free and fair elections. So at the end of the day, a lot of us were in Selma just a month ago, commemorating the 55th anniversary of the March for the Voting Rights Act, and Representative John Lewis magically, amazingly, powerfully exhorted us in the middle of that bridge to do everything we can to protect the right to vote. And now we are faced with an unprecedented challenge in meeting that moment. And we appreciate very much all of you and your voices and leadership at this critical time to make sure that no voter has to choose between their public health and a functioning democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanita, for your leadership and for your partnership with the Joint Center. We really appreciate you. Now, we've got some top legal minds from the country here on this call, and we thought it was important to make sure that we also have experts on Black voter turnout here to give some insights here. We'll now turn toward Black Voters Matter Fund founder, LaTosha Brown. LaTosha, are you there?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay.
LaTosha, great to see you.
Great to see you as well. So I'm happy to be here, kind of building off Anita, and I'm happy of the opportunity for really to be able to talk about this issue. As we've continued our work, and with Black Voters Matter, we're continuing to work in 11 states and some targeted micro areas with African-American voters throughout the country. What we're hearing is there is a lot of concern around the two things that are always a concern, and that's around access and safety. And so when we're talking about preparing for this election cycle, I think it's critical and key. I do want to lift up that it's really important that we don't get caught up in just what we think the swing states, but that recognizing that the majority of African-American voters are actually in the South, and there's some down ballot races and some Senate races, some critical races in the South. That's really key, that we also can't just get caught up in just a presidential election, but this has implications for us in many ways and on many different levels. And so there are a couple of points I just want to make. One, just reiterating what Vanita raised, that it's really important that we make sure that we have safeguards, that voting by mail, we know this is going to have to be an option. We're pushing it, we're supporting it. The people that we're talking to on the ground, they want this as an option, but we also want other options as well. That we know that part of, even in the African-American community, the way that we vote, that in many ways there's a cultural dynamic in terms of the way that we vote and how we vote. And so if that is the case, then we need to make sure that we have a variety of options, including making sure that there's some on-site voting that have the safety and the security, because we don't want any of our people to have to go to the polls and be subjected, making a decision around voting or their health. And so this, we feel like that is key and critical as we go forward. The other thing that I'll just raise is really around kind of the access and the access in general. That part of what's going to be really, really important is to make sure that there's support with civil rights organizations and organizations that are doing voter mobilization, because voter education is going to be a key component in this process as well. And so I just want to encourage CBC members to really, that we need the two things that's really important for us right now is around the issue of access and the issue of safety. And so that we want to make sure that we have as many options as possible. We're engaged in a lawsuit right now in the state of Georgia around postage. We need to make sure that we don't allow many of these governors in these Republican states to actually create another barrier for us, particularly with the stripping of the pre-clearance clause and other things. And so it's really important that we have safeguards and we have options, and that we have watchdogs, and we're actually paying attention to this process, and that this COVID-19 does not become another punitive way to prevent us from participating in the process. So thank you, Spencer.
Hey, LaTosha, thanks so much. And thanks to your co-founder, Cliff Albright. You all are doing really important work here. We'll now turn to Lawyers Committee President Kristen Clarke. Kristen, are you there?
Yes. Thanks, Spencer. Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much for pulling us together today. I hope that everybody is safe and well, and hope the same for your loved ones. Really appreciate the framing remarks by Sherrilyn and Vanita and LaTosha. What I wanted to do with my time was talk about the very unique and specific impact that the pandemic is having on voter registration opportunities. There's been a lot of focus on the election day access barriers that we are up against. But I do think that we need to give some very specific attention to the way in which the pandemic has essentially had a chilling effect on the way that we carry out voter registration in our country. As we all know, with people kind of confined to their homes, our campuses are not active reaching new young voters. Our churches are not able to activate their congregants in the way that they have historically and traditionally. People are not able to knock on doors and reach people who have not made it onto the rolls. And we run the risk of missing the opportunity to bring millions of people onto the rolls during a presidential election year, which historically is the moment when we see the kind of apex in terms of the pattern over a 4-year period. It's a presidential election year where we tend to capture lots of people. About 35% of people make it onto the registration rolls by way of their DMV or a social service agency. So we're doing a lot of work right now ensuring that as these agencies attempt to continue serving the public telephonically or online, that they are making voter registration opportunities simultaneously available to the public. What can we do about this? I think that there is an opportunity for us to push for online voter registration, which currently is not in place in about a dozen states. Same day voter registration is also a way to kind of provide a final opportunity for people to make it onto the rolls who may get missed during this tumultuous year. Automatic voter registration, and again, pushing our DMV and social service agencies that are mandated under the National Voter Registration Act to integrate voter registration into the new normal and the new ways in which they are interacting with the public are all ways in which we can endeavor to respond to this crisis. Whether or not we can get some of these measures in place as emergency steps that we're taking for just this year, I think needs to be a part of our narrative. There will indeed be some hostile states very much adverse to the idea of permanent same-day registration, but there is a window of opportunity right now with so many people in the public impacted by this pandemic for us to try and push some of these important reforms forward. I'll close by noting that we are short on time. Today marks 200 days until the November general election. So we've got a lot of work to do at both the state and federal election level to deal with the barriers that we're up against. As Vanita noted, there are some issues. I just want to pivot for a brief moment to talk about the real barriers with respect to absentee voting. We litigated a case in Stacey Abrams' good state of Georgia, Gwinnett County, in the 2018 midterm election cycle, where officials rejected absentee ballots in mass. We went and looked, and the rejection rate was 3 times higher for African Americans than it was for white voters. So vigilance will be required as we push absentee voting to make sure that those ballots are counted and not disqualified or unlawfully rejected. I'll also note very briefly the experience of Native American voters in our country. We brought suit in Utah that in a county, San Juan County, that went to 100% vote by mail. They neglected to take into account the very real experience of Navajo speaking voters who need oral assistance in order to cast a meaningful ballot. So as we push forward these reforms, it's critical that we be mindful of the very real experiences of voters of color, and that we move with all deliberate speed. I want to thank folks in the CBC and staff members for championing for funding to drive forward a lot of these reforms. As we go to a fourth spending bill, it'll be really critical that we think about accountability. There are a number of states that have taken funding from that third bill and with open hostility have said, we're not using it for election reform. We're going to use these funds for the pandemic, for COVID responses. And that's not the intent of Congress when it put forward that $400 million. So building in some accountability measures will be really critical as we go forward. Thanks so much, Spencer.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and thanks for your leadership. The Lawyers Committee's done a great job in terms of shifting and stepping up to the plate to address COVID-19. So thank you so much. We will now turn to Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who also clerked for the greatest Court of Appeals judge in the history of our nation, Damon J. Keith. Jocelyn, are you there? I think Jocelyn
How's that? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay, we did it. Great.
Right.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, Spencer, for including me in this. And thank you all for your leadership. I also started my career as a legal intern at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, working with Vanita and several others. And really, that set me on my course in many ways to do the work I'm doing now, which is as a Secretary of State, trying to lead and bring all these best practices to Michigan, where we have not just Detroit, but Flint, Muskegon, and Benton Harbor, and several other communities around the state where we need to ensure every vote is casted safely and securely. I'll say top level, we and so many other states need that guaranteed funding without a significant matching requirement from Congress. We need standards and accountability for how that money should be used. And we also need, in some cases, in some states, where the state election officer may not direct those funds to the local communities that need it most, some sort of consideration there. For example, while we're working to make sure our allocation of about $11.2 million from that stimulus package, which is frankly about a quarter of what we need to operate our elections into the pandemic in August and November, where we have 2 statewide elections this year. We could envision a scenario where the communities that perhaps need significant support, or clerks in those communities, like the clerk of the city of Detroit, the clerk in Flint, need additional support and funding. We're working to get that funding, but we can't neglect the local community-specific needs in allocating those statewide funding. Michigan, beyond that, provides an example of the feasibility of moving from a state where we were 2 years ago, a state that did not have online voter reg. We did not have same-day voter reg. We did not have automatic voter reg. We did not have vote by mail or right to vote by mail. We now, less than 2 years later, have all of those things because of a citizen-initiated initiative to amend our state constitution to create all of those rights. That initiative did not come with funding to implement those rights. We were able to get some from the state government, and but of course we saw firsthand how the first move in that it is possible to transition quickly from a state that doesn't have any of those things to a state that now has automatic voter reg, same-day voter reg, online voter reg, vote by mail. We did it. We already implemented a statewide election, our March 10th presidential primary. We saw that young people were taking advantage particularly in college communities, but at a rate of 2 to 1. Of the ability to register to vote and cast their ballot on election day. So, but the first myth we want to dispel, and that we're working actively to demonstrate in Michigan, is that it is possible to move quickly, implementing best practices from many other states that have already done it, and with effective funding and leadership to implement a lot of the changes that we need to have in place in every state in this country this fall to ensure that voters throughout the country have the ability to cast their vote safely and securely during this pandemic. We are also working under the assumption where we're hoping for the best and essentially planning for the worst. We know Michigan is a critical state, and the eyes of the country will in many ways be on us in November. because of that, we're working to bring a lot of the best practices to Michigan from other states, while also preparing to operate the November election as if it were held today, meaning under a lockdown, under a stay-at-home order. We pray and hope that's not the case, and we're preparing several other contingencies as well, but we're doing that importantly so that we are prepared to turn on a dime to deliver the democracy that voters deserve in November, and also in our statewide primary election in August. All of that, again, is made possible with funding. And we're now in a moment where the partisan, as you're all seeing in Washington as well, the partisan realities that in many ways we all know led to the challenges we all observed in Wisconsin. Those partisan realities are also happening at the state level that will make it nearly impossible for us to acquire at the state level the funding we need to ensure that everything we need to do in November, ensuring all those choices, vote by mail, in-person voting and everything in between, early voting, are available to our voters. That funding is crucial. And that funding is crucial for two reasons. One, as it's already been mentioned, voter education, kind of the external side, and also for the infrastructure side. On the external side, getting the information to voters, which we found is important when you're changing election rules, even if it is in line of making voting more accessible and voter registration more accessible, you have to ensure, as we all know, that every single citizen has the knowledge that they need to exercise all of those choices. That does not happen automatically, and it is expensive to do it effectively, and especially in times like these, meet voters where they're at and ensure that our messaging is effective and impactful and educational. On the other side, the infrastructure side, we can't underestimate the challenges in Michigan and other states where you do have to, if we're going to move quickly to implement many changes, that we have the support, financial and otherwise, from our local communities, from our postal service, and from several other entities at the local level, so that we are able to process those absentee ballots or those mail-in ballots effectively. We're able to support and pay prepaid postage for voters. We're able to send out absentee ballots or applications to vote absentee. All of those infrastructure side of things need funding as well to make a reality. And then again, circling back to knowing that everything is taking on or risks being affected by a partisan or other partisan agendas or motivations that we're seeing play out in the executive office nationwide, the presidency. We also know that the lack of funding can be used as an opportunity to ensure that we aren't able to deliver the good government, pro-democracy infrastructure that we need to make sure that if we do all these things, that they function properly. The last two things I'll say, and what our experience has been in Michigan, is number one, cannot underestimate the importance of either having a governor, as we do in Michigan, who's been supportive at implementing executive orders where we need them, and providing that additional support from the educational side where we need it. In states that don't have that, members of Congress need to provide that leadership. The members of the Senate need to provide that leadership. That leadership is critical, and that voice is critical. And in many cases where governors can issue executive orders, we know that has helped us in Michigan. It has hurt other states. And then the last thing I'll just emphasize, and we all know this, the planning starts now. We are already developing our plans for November, identifying the budget needs and all the details, and we can't wait much longer to execute a lot of the changes we need. And the reason why is this is not to me just about November, although we know November is critical. This is also about defining how we as a country will operate democracy during a crisis like this or others. Every decision we make collectively at every level will define precedent and set precedent for future decisions that impact our democracy. With that mindful eye, we also recognize that as we implement all of these things, or as we work to implement all of these things, from easier voter registration opportunities to easier access to the vote, ensuring they succeed and do not fall victim to those who would like to have them not succeed and use that as an example for us to not expand these things into the future, is also something we have to be mindful of right now. So leadership, funding, accountability, all of those things, and partnerships will come into play. And the bottom line is we can get this done. We can do this if all of those factors are on the table.
Jocelyn, thanks so much for your leadership nationally on these issues and also for your service to folks back home in my home state of Michigan. So thank you so much. We will now turn to, just frankly, a great leader. I've certainly benefited from her counsel, her insights, and her commitment. Fair Fight founder, Stacey Abrams. Stacey, are you there?
I am.
Welcome here.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Spencer, for having me. And thank you to Vanita and Kristen and Cheryl and Jocelyn and LaTosha. I get to bring up the rear. And what I will say is ditto. Every piece that they've emphasized is critical to the conversation of how we protect our elections. And the launch of Fair Fight in 2018 and Fair Fight 2020 and 2019, our work across 18 states, is driven by the reality of what we faced in Georgia. Georgia was a singular example of the failure of democracy, but it was not solely the example. And we know that in the 18 battleground states across the country, particularly those states that will determine the presidency, the US Senate control, whether we hold on to the House, and whether we pick up those down ballot races like folks like Jocelyn Benson and others, and if we flip chambers to control redistricting in 2021, those decisions will be made in November. In 2018, our campaign did something unprecedented in Georgia. We sent out 1.6 million pre-populated, postage-paid applications for absentee ballots to likely voters for my campaign. And the result was astonishing. For the first time in the history of Georgia, Democrats actually outperformed Republicans in absentee ballot participation. But what was even more striking was that we had a higher participation rate of accepted ballots from African Americans than our population. So 39% of the accepted ballots were from African Americans, although they only comprise 31% of our voting population. What this demonstrated is two things. One, if we do it right, it works. If we do it right, if we invest in education, in outreach, and if we remove the poll tax of having our citizens actually having to pay to vote, then we will see increased participation. But a secondary part of what we did was what Jocelyn spoke to, which is that we had to do education. This is not a traditional method of voting for many people in the South, and particularly for African Americans. What was more troubling, as Kristen knows, is that we live in a state where the Secretary of State, now governor, actually put 12 people in jail with 120 felony counts for using absentee ballots in 2010. And so there has been a chilling effect in the South about using absentee ballots. But we can restore that usage if we do the work of education, investment, and also recognizing that not everyone is going to shift to vote by mail. There are a number of organizations that do believe in universal vote by mail, but I think as it has been very ably explained, there are legitimate barriers to doing so. We have to remember that vote by mail is not designed to replace in-person voting. It's designed to make in-person voting safer. And we should talk about it as a filter. If you have 100 people who are getting in line to vote, if you can move 75 of them back home so they vote by mail, then you're only trying to deal with the safety of 25. And if you get 10 of those folks to vote early, then you've now limited your needs to 15 people in those lines, and that can be done safely. And we have to remember that the disabled will have to vote in person by and large. Those with language barriers often need in-person voting. And because of COVID-19, we are going to have a huge displacement of people who will not have a home to call their own. And so for the homeless or those displaced, vote by mail is not an option. And so they need to be able to go in person to cast their ballots. And so we should talk about it and think of it as part of the litany of opportunity, not as a sole responsibility. But we also have to push back on the lie that is told about voter fraud. Voter fraud is not real. It is often voter confusion, and the few examples that we can find are actually election fraud, people who are gaming the system, but that is not the reality. By and large, people want to do right, and they will do right if they understand. And we've been proud to work in cooperation with a number of folks to ensure that information is provided and that safe information is provided so that people can participate when they want to. The last thing I'll say is this. We have to vote in 2020, but we also have to remember that the allocation of political power is also happening through the 2020 census. I not only launched Fair Fight, I launched Fair Count, because 1 out of every 3 African Americans lives in a hard to count census tract that will be undercounted, particularly in this pandemic. But the allocation of $1.5 trillion in funding and the political power for the next decade will happen based on the census. And so we need to encourage Congress to not only put in place the resources to make voting safe and accessible, and it has to come from Congress, because as Jocelyn pointed out, we do not have governors in every state that actually believe in democracy, but we also have to hold the line on ensuring that access to the census is made available to everyone, and that we are doing our work to ensure that by the end of 2020, every vote is counted and every person is counted. Thank you so much, Spencer.
Thanks so much, Stacey. And thanks also just for going through why this doesn't work for everyone. It's really important that people understand that. So thank you very much. It's not just a theoretical piece. This is reality. So thank you so much. So we've got a question from Nina Patel. Nina? And while Nina's coming on, let me just say, CBC staff, please come on in and be a part of the discussion. This is time for discussion, comments, Q&A, that kind of thing. Nina, thanks so much.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
We can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for putting this together. Your leadership on this is really helping to guide, I think, hopefully what will be in the next package. And again, thank you to all the panelists. I think each of you has brought some critical issues to the forefront. And I do think one of my issues, and I know from Representative Bobby Scott's office, one of the concerns is the security of polling stations. In this pandemic, I think several of the panelists highlighted the fact that, in Milwaukee, they went from 120 polling stations to 5. And what kind of strategies could we employ, could we advocate to make sure that we don't see that kind of drastic decrease in polling stations? Because I think that's really going to create a lot of fear in the public. And, given the nature of this particular pandemic, I think the last thing we want to see is people in those long lines. So if anyone on the panel has any ideas about what kind of the best practices might be to prevent that outcome, the closure, whether it's at a local level or a state level of so many polling places during critical election time.
This is Cheryl, and I'll just say something briefly because I spent some time focusing on this in Wisconsin. The reduction in polling places in Milwaukee in particular was largely driven by the fact that poll workers called out and said that they weren't going to man the polls. And it's important for us to remember that in many of our communities, as in all communities, poll workers are very often elderly members of the community. So they are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 infection. They are particularly concerned about infection. And therefore, this goes to the issue of the polling places themselves and what assurances we can provide that the polling places have been made safe and that the method of handling and managing in-person voting will be done safely. Wisconsin was so chaotic, and this is part of why we need to be doing the work of November yesterday, that there needs to be a protocol that will allow poll workers to feel safe in manning polling stations so that they don't have to close them. We need outreach to younger people to become poll workers and to be trained this summer to work as poll workers in November. But most importantly, we need to know that polling places have been cleaned, that every poll worker will have the PPE that they need to be able to safely interact with the public. We need to have protocols about how voting books are handled. We need to ensure that every person standing in a line has a mask and has gloves. The machines need to be wiped down and cleaned and so forth. And when you can assure people of this protocol and that these protocols are in place, you are more likely then to not have poll workers calling out in mass as they did in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee. This is my grandson, everyone, hello. In Milwaukee, which resulted in the reduction in polling places. The other piece is increasing early voting. To the extent you have long early voting opportunities, it creates less of a rush to have all of the poll workers, all working the same day. We need to be staggering out our election, not thinking of it as a one-day event, but thinking of it as an event that unfolds over several weeks. And so thinking about the integrity of the polling place itself, the protocol of how people vote and of how poll workers are protected is critical. And then thinking about extending the period so that we're not creating concentrations on election day of people physically at the polls. And this is critical for all the reasons that have been already suggested, because there are many members of our population who want to vote in person. And we need to create a framework in which they can do so comfortably and safely, and in which poll workers who also come from our communities can be assured of their safety if they're working in the polling places.
So if I could just add two things, I agree completely. We're actually trying to do a lot of those things in practice in Michigan because we have a May 5th local election in about 50 communities throughout the state. And we're using that as an opportunity. We encountered the same issue where citizens, particularly elderly or clerks, said, look, I don't know how I can staff the polls. And so we launched a statewide campaign. We called it Democracy MVP, saying election workers are MVPs of democracy. We need you to step up all around the state, sign up here, and you can go to michigan.gov/democracymvp to see the portal that we created. We launched that about 5 days ago again, we have about 50 local communities. So we were hoping we'd get a few hundred people signing up to be poll workers or election workers, meaning taking those ballots as they come in through the mail, opening them, counting them, every aspect of the process, greeting people when they come in on election day. We had 13 people sign up in a weekend to work the polls in a May 5th local election. We're now transitioning to make this about our statewide elections in August and November as well. But we have, over 1,000 people said, send me to whatever local community you need. In Michigan, as long as you're a registered voter, you can be an election worker in any community. So that effort can be helpful. And again, it doesn't have to be the Secretary of State who does this. It is ideally that person, but if you're in a state that doesn't have that, members of Congress and others, clerks can similarly work to recruit poll workers. We're also training them once recruited. So we're sending them out, deploying them trained. And then parallel to that, we have established protocols for how clerk's offices and any entity interacting with voters on election day itself on our May 5th local elections need to be physically structured and what supplies are needed. So we've actually physically mapped out recommended layouts for not just a precinct, but also the counting board. So we similarly need to convene people to process all the mail-in ballots and open them and count them. So, and that takes people too. So we set up physical maps of what we want every clerk to create or recommendations. And then we're also working to provide masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, and all of the rest. Election workers are essential employees under the federal guidelines. So we have that to use as a reason why we also want to have these supplies for our election workers during this time. I say all that to say that's what we're trying to do in practice. I think what could be helpful is if there's some sort of, whether this comes from the center or whether this comes from another organization on this call or Congress, the Election Assistance Commission, some basic guideline for what precincts should look like, what absentee counting boards should look like, and hopefully with funding, but at least recommendations for what every election worker should have, and then also guidelines as to how to recruit election workers right now for various different reasons. People are willing to sign up and say, send me, I want to defend democracy, or I just would like to take a day and work and work the elections and are willing to do everything that's needed to work for that day. So it is, again, it is possible. It does take that leadership, and happy to connect with anyone offline about what we learned throughout the next few weeks in Michigan. But what was unexpected was just the significant amount of interest of people who do want to serve as election workers during this time.
I can add one piece to that. I can add one piece. One of the other pieces we have to think about is vote anywhere centers. What's going to happen due to the lack of opportunity, especially in more rural communities, is that if you have only one precinct to go to, or if you're in a dense area where they're going to resource wealthier precincts more than they will lower income precincts. We need to actually use the technology that we use for early voting, which is that you have centers where you can vote from anywhere, so that within each county, you can go to any place that's available and cast your ballot. That's going to be critical in November, because what we also have to remember, and this is not intended as a partisan slide, just a reality, we know that for the first time since 1981, the Republican National Committee can participate in ballot security measures. That means that they can use hard and soft dollars to intimidate voters at the polls. And we know that in 1981, the participation of African Americans was targeted through intimidation. It was so bad and so egregious. This is the first election, presidential election, where they've been permitted to do so again. And we have done deep research through Fair Fight, to identify the fact that they've already targeted the 15 states where they intend to do ballot security work. They've already started it here in Georgia by creating a voter fraud task force. So they first said, we're going to send out 6.9 million applications for absentee ballots. And then 2 weeks later, the Secretary of State announced that anyone who made a mistake and had any issues, they would have a law enforcement panel that would aggressively go after anyone who made a mistake on their absentee ballots. That is going to be on steroids by November, because there is a direct correlation between people of color using these processes and the accusations of fraud and the accusations of intentional misbehavior. One of the ways we can limit, for example, the deployment of the National Guard as the poll workers is by making sure that people can go anywhere to cast their ballots, by having those centers, and more importantly, by having those centers encouraged through legislation. We can help people go to places where they actually will be protected by being a part of a larger community. And it's a lot harder to target a community when you don't know where they're going to be to vote. And so I think it's an important tool that we have to take advantage of, that if you can vote early in person for 20 days, you certainly should be able to do the same thing on Election Day.
And this is Vanita. I just want to add a couple of, can you hear me, Spencer?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
Just picking up on what Stacey said, we're already hearing that there's a plan among some RNC members to actually have police officers at the polling places allegedly kind of seeking to weaponize COVID as the reason to have this. The long history of voter intimidation is well known to all of us on this call, but there will be, exploitation of the moment to try to engage in what will be perceived as lawful placement of police officers at polling stations, particularly in higher density urban populations, which affect everyone that we know. It's very intentional and targeted, and those plans are already getting revealed. So the recommendations that Sherrilyn listed out, the need to get those in place and to have voters be informed and to have the public be informed is only going to help in the recruitment and training process to bring poll workers and new younger poll workers who may feel a little bit more safe or more safer at being able to be physically present at the polls. But also remember the backdrop here. The Leadership Conference just several months ago issued a report about the systematic closure of polling places long before COVID. This has been an effect of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act through the Shelby County decision. We have to fight these forces to make sure that there's enough polling places. COVID's made this incredibly more challenging, but the need to really have this kind of guidance in place that we will be able to then use to inform the public about what the safety precautions are, and to have the rules changes in place in the states that will allow for people to feel like they can do social distancing and have the kind of CDC compliant polling places. All of this is of a piece, and it is going to, this is why time is of the essence to get this all done in the next several weeks, and to make these changes, because we otherwise are going to be seeing things happen in November that were long part of a concerted agenda to suppress voters of color using voter intimidation and really weaponizing COVID. And that is what we need to fight back at every turn. These were already going to be challenges for us in 2020, but the anti-voting forces are hard at work right now trying to use this moment to kind of advance what they wanted. And that's why these reforms and making sure that the public is aware of them is so incredibly crucial.
Thanks so much, Vanita. Well, here's what we're going to do. Stacey, I've got a question for you that comes from the floor that I'll ask you. And then what we'll do is we will go with closings, 1-minute closers, and we'll go actually in the same order that we went in terms of the opening here. So Stacey, I'll just come to you for this question, then we'll go to Sherrilyn and we'll work our way to Stacey here and then close it out. So Stacey, the question is, how can Congress push for automatic absentee ballot application? In other words, either whether it's vote by mail or automatic absentee. So as opposed to, I guess, somebody having to apply for a ballot application, it being automatic. Any thoughts on that?
I would say it should simply be in the legislation that authorizes the resources. And here's the thing to remember. States operate, and certainly Secretary of State, correct me if I misstate this, but states do not operate 2 election systems on November 3rd. They're going to operate an election system that conforms to federal requirements. And so if the federal requirement is that absentee ballots have to be sent to every registered eligible voter, if that's in the legislation and the resources accompany it, that is the best way to guarantee that absentee ballots are sent to every person. The reality is, if it's an application that has to be filled out and returned, and then you have to wait for the ballot to reach you, we know that in Georgia, in Florida, in North Carolina, in Arizona, there are dangerous delays in actually receiving those applications, receiving those ballots, and then being able to prove that your ballot was actually returned and received. And that goes to the issue of whether, if you're in Arizona, if you're Native American or Latino, your ballot, if you mail it back, it has to be received by 7 p.m. on election day. The problem is your mail could be routed through New Mexico or Utah before it gets to Phoenix. You have no control over it. And so by putting into the legislation that these are federal requirements, because every single ballot in November will be a federal ballot, people aren't going to run a separate election simply to have to avoid this process, I don't think. Now, there are some states that are hell-bent on it, but I believe that the economic challenges of COVID-19 actually will compel better behavior. But I think it's up to Congress to put in place the best practices. And I think the legislation that Ron Wyden and Amy Klobuchar have put forward give us really good parameters for that. That's the legislation we need. Let them fight back, but do not concede the point before it's done. Because as everyone on this call has said, I used to be deputy city attorney in Atlanta, and part of my job was the elections. We had to be planning now for a November election, and that was when things were good. We have to understand that the urgency of this decision and the necessity of creating uniformity is going to be essential and vital for these elections to be legitimate. That's the most important part of this. And so I would say that we can basically fund the process by saying, send out these ballots, and these ballots have to be postage paid for return. That is something I think we can mandate, and I think Congress should mandate. Let them fight it out in court if they don't like it.
Thanks so much, Stacey. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go for a closing thought. We're going to start back with Sherrilyn in terms of a closing thought, go through our speakers. We've got one more question, and certainly speakers, as you kind of wrap up with your closing thought, feel free to address it. The question is, absentee ballot applications undelivered are trending in the thousands across rural Georgia due to physical addresses, not mailing routes here. It's a huge issue. How's it being addressed? I assume that Stacey and LaTosha may have some insights on that, but anyone should feel free to go for it. But just closing thoughts, Sherrilyn, will come to you.
So I cannot emphasize enough how heavily and seriously you must be leaned in to getting precisely what we need. Even if this legislation is perfect, we will not be out of the woods, because we understand that there are forces that are running the full bag of tricks that have been in employ for decades. It was in 1984 and 85 that Jeff Sessions, then U.S. Attorney for Alabama, prosecuted LDF clients and accused them of absentee ballot fraud. Now, we were successful in having them acquitted. These were activists who were close companions of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King for many decades. We were successful in having them acquitted, but the result was that elderly voters in Perry County, Alabama, no longer wanted to vote absentee for years to come. So we understand that when they use the tactics that are available to them, the effect is to frighten people away from wanting to participate. And what that means is that even if this legislation has everything we want in it, we still at the other end have to make sure that we, those of us who are lawyers and engaged in civil rights lawyering, still will need to be vigilant to bring the cases in the weeks before Election Day, to bring the cases on Election Day, to bring the cases after Election Day, to challenge voters suddenly ending up on the inactive list, to challenge the failure to deliver votes, to accuse of voter fraud. We already will have that heavy lift to carry, even if this legislation is perfect. And I say all that to say that therefore this legislation needs to be as perfect as possible. We need to be pushing to get everything that we just described in this phone call. Whatever is the fight, I understand that politics is compromise, but it's critical that you start from a position of strength and that you stand flat-footed with examples from the states of what can be done and what should be done to deal with this election during this pandemic. We are standing behind you. Please let us know when you need us to activate our communities, to put pressure on and to lean on. But it is critical and vitally important that none of these issues are up for compromise at the beginning. We understand that there may be back and forth, but we've got to have a system that gives us a fighting chance of ensuring that African Americans can fully participate in the political process. And if this legislation is perfect and right, we will still have an uphill battle, and it will still require all of us on this call, as well as many others, to do the work of protecting the vote for African Americans in the election in November. So please reach out to us. Please lean in heavily. Thank you for joining this call, and I'm grateful to all of my colleagues for the extraordinary work that you all are doing. We have our work cut out for us, but honestly, if not now, when?
Thanks so much, Sherrilyn. Vanita will come to you just after Vanita, we'll go straight to Kristen. So after Vanita, we'll go straight to Kristen. Thanks, Vanita.
Yeah, I would just want to add, I think of the kind of major mission before us right now. I think of it as bucketed into the federal piece, which is to have Congress allocate the money that we need to be able to put in place all of the things that we just talked about. You know, I think it is going to be hard to pass substantive legislation like the Klobuchar-Wyden bill. We have to push to make it happen, but I think we should all be realistic about what the chances are given the makeup of the Senate, but those contain the actual measures that we need states to enact. So if it can't be done federally, and we're going to push like hell to try to do everything we can to do it, we have to then do the second bucket of work, which is what a lot of our organizations are already quite involved in, which is making these rule changes in the states, and to have leaders like Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson partner with other leaders across with Secretaries of State, Republican and Democratic, to make these changes now is a major, major thing that we need to help make happen. But time is of the essence. It is going to be too late if states are starting to make these pivots in July. It's just going to be too late to make this happen. The third bucket is the voter education piece that we've been talking about, and it's going to be an all hands on deck effort. I think the CBC members and the staff can be so incredibly powerful, both at urging their state officials to get to work, but also using their pulpit and platform to educate voters throughout the summer and the fall about these voting changes. And then I think it's the vigilance that we've all been talking about, because we know that there are a lot of very well-funded, powerful forces working to chill participation and prevent Black and Brown communities from showing up at the polls and being engaged and participating. So that's how I think of this work. I think the CBC plays such a critical leadership role at every stage of this, and just really want to thank you, Spencer, and the CBC for putting this together. We are all in to do whatever we can in each of these areas of work, because we need to protect the right to vote and protect the legitimacy of our elections.
Thanks, Vanita. We have this moderator fell down on the job and didn't finish us up in an hour. So we had two participants who actually had to leave. So we'll talk to him and deal with him. So we're going to go straight to Jocelyn Benson here for closing remarks, and then Stacey.
Thank you, Spencer, again for pulling this together. And it's great to see so many of you who I've worked with throughout decades, now all of us coming together for what is a critical moment. And look, we already knew 2020 was going to be a defining moment for the history of our country and for our democracy. But now, political realities aside, we know that this year, the actions all of us take this year will define the future of our democracy and our republic for years to come. And not just with regards to how we're operating things, but the decisions we're making that will, again, create the precedent for future leaders that will guide their decisions as well. And I want and hope that we can do all of this with an eye towards, as we're all working to, emphasizing the need to ensure that we meet voters where they're at, create options in every state, using all the tools at our disposal, political, legal, funding, and otherwise, to get to a point where in November, every citizen knows exactly how to exercise their vote and knows exactly how to do so without risking their health. We should assume that, and we all are working with data sets and all the rest, we're all hoping for the best, but we should be preparing to be operating a November election in the same scenario in which Wisconsin operated theirs in terms of the restrictions and challenges. But we've got the opportunities and the tools at our disposal to win and ensure, and by win, I mean ensuring that every single citizen who wants to vote is able to do so and knows exactly how to do so, and that their votes are counted accurately. We need from the federal government, not just vocal leadership from all of you, but funding on both the voter education and infrastructure side, funding tied to standards and guidelines, whether it be the incredible action that it would have if we had the authority to send every registered voter a ballot, as done in many states, and have them return it and have that postage be prepaid. That's the tool. Like that, there are those options, and so Congress, leaders in Congress, you can be those leaders that we need to make this a democracy that lives up to the ideals of our founders and those who fought to ensure equal access to the vote over time. And the last thing I'll say is that we're in a war, that we're not, this isn't a unilateral fight. There is a similarly well-funded, focused effort on the all other side of this, not partisan, but just from an issue standpoint, that is coming and I think has an interest in creating chaos and confusion and misinformation in November. So we are in a battle literally for the future of our republic and our democracy in every way. And I'm grateful to be fighting alongside all of you. I'm optimistic we can be successful, but it's going to be it's going to take all of us working together and in Congress getting us funding in order to be successful.
Thanks. Stacey?
I want to join everyone and again, thanking you, Spencer, and thanking, can you guys hear me? Okay, sorry. Thanking you all for convening this. Thank you to the CBC members and their staff who are on, as well as those who are advocates. I think there are three things. One is that we have to learn not only from Wisconsin, the terrible tragedy that election represented, but also the deep well of interest that we saw. Fair Fight 2020 operates in Wisconsin, and our voter protection director, I spoke to him the next morning, and he told me the stories of getting phone calls from grandmothers who were deathly afraid of getting COVID, but were even more afraid of what would happen to their grandchildren if they didn't vote, what was going to happen in the next decade to their children, their grandchildren. And so we have an earnestness of reality that is pervading Americans. They know what's at stake. We watch every day where either we have successful leadership or failed leadership, and people are hungry for successful leadership again. And that can only happen with an effective election in November. Number two, we have to understand the power that the CBC has. In 2019, when the administration was refusing to fund the census, it was the CBC that harnessed the Tri-Caucus and got $5 billion finally added to fund the census, to ensure that hard to count communities were not going to be wholly left out of the most significant census we have had ever. This is the most diverse our nation has been, the largest we have been, and unfortunately, We have the most concentrated set of leaders who do not want us to be seen or heard. And the CBC had the power to force that conversation. That power has to be used when it comes to voting. Because the third piece is this: as much as COVID-19 is putting into sharp relief the threat to our lives and our economy, we know that the future of our nation is determined by the leaders we select. And we cannot select those leaders if we cannot participate in the election. There is no do-over for November. There can be litigation to make it better, and there can be fights to make it smarter, but once it is done, we are stuck with the result. And so our responsibility is to do as much as we can, as soon as we can, because this is about our lives. It's about what kind of lives we live in 2021 and beyond. It's a question of who gets to speak for America. Do Americans get to speak, or do others get to tell us what we are and who we are? The CBC has always been the leader in holding the conscience of America accountable for doing right. And this COVID bill, the next one that comes up, is the last opportunity to hold America accountable for being the democracy it has sworn to be. And so I'm just looking to all of you. Fair Fight 2020 stands with you. We stand with all of these organizations, not only in solidarity, but in hope that we will do the right thing and we will save our country. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for the work you do.
Thank you, and thank all the speakers, everyone who participated, who came as well, all the CBC staff and our other guests. Thank you for joining us. If there are others who missed this that you think would benefit from seeing this hour segment, you can share it with them. It will be posted at jointcenter.org. We'll get it up within the next 24 hours, and we'll also blast it out. We also encourage you to go to jointcenter.org and sign up for our COVID-19 policy and Black community updates. We do weekly updates in terms of where things are. So thanks all for joining us, and we are adjourned. Thanks.